My name is Margaret Rose Sullivan, and I'm about to tell you something that will make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty. 3 weeks ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for my life after a massive stroke. My daughter Jennifer was by my bedside, holding my hand, whispering sweet words about how I needed to get better because she couldn't live without me. What I didn't know was that she was simultaneously planning my funeral with the same funeral director who had handled her father's service 2 years earlier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I found out because I woke up from my medically induced coma earlier than expected, and the first thing I heard wasn't prayers for my recovery or words of love. It was my daughter on the phone in the hallway outside my room, discussing flower arrangements and catering options for what she kept calling the inevitable. The inevitable. That's what my life had become to her. Not a miracle to fight for, not a mother to cherish, but an inconvenience to be managed and scheduled around. I suppose I should start from the beginning, though the beginning feels like a lifetime ago now. I'm 73 years old, and until that October morning when everything changed, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I stood in this world. I was Margaret Sullivan, widow of Patrick Sullivan, mother to Jennifer and David, grandmother to 3 beautiful children, and the owner of Sullivan's Corner Market, the little grocery store that had been the heart of our small town of Millbrook for over 40 years. Patrick and I had built that store from nothing. We'd started with a loan that terrified us both, sleeping on a mattress in the tiny apartment above the shop, counting every penny, and dreaming of the day we could afford real furniture. We worked 18-hour days, took turns watching the children when they were small, and slowly, gradually, built something we were proud of. The store wasn't just our livelihood. It was our legacy, our contribution to the community that had embraced us when Patrick's parents immigrated from Ireland with nothing but hope and determination. Patrick always said that the store would take care of us in our old age, and then it would take care of our children. He had this vision of Jennifer and David working side by side, maybe expanding into the empty lot next door, carrying on the Sullivan name with pride. He died believing that dream was still possible, even though our children had made it clear years earlier that they had different plans for their lives. Jennifer, my firstborn, had always been ambitious in ways that both impressed and worried me. She was smart, beautiful, and utterly ruthless when it came to getting what she wanted. As a child, she'd been the one organizing elaborate schemes to get extra allowance or talking her way out of punishments with a combination of charm and manipulation that left Patrick and me wondering where we'd gone wrong. We told ourselves it was leadership potential, that she'd channel that drive into something positive. We were partially right. She'd channeled it into a successful career as a pharmaceutical sales representative, traveling constantly, earning more money than Patrick and I had ever dreamed of, and living a lifestyle that seemed to require her to look down on everything about her upbringing. David, 2 years younger, had taken a different path. Where Jennifer was all sharp edges and calculated moves, David was gentle and artistic, the kind of boy who preferred books to sports and spent hours drawing elaborate fantasy worlds in the margins of his school notebooks. He'd gone to art school against Patrick's wishes, moved to Portland, and now made a modest living as a freelance graphic designer while pursuing his passion for pottery. He called regularly, visited when he could, afford to, and never made me feel like my small-town life was something to be ashamed of. But he also never showed any interest in the store, and I'd long ago accepted that his heart belonged to his art, not to the family business. After Patrick died of a heart attack 2 years ago, the store became my world in a way it had never been before. It was where I went to escape the silence of our house, where I could feel useful and needed, where the familiar rhythms of stocking shelves and chatting with customers kept me connected to the living world. The regular customers became my extended family. Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday for her weekly groceries and always brought me updates about her grandchildren. Tom Bradley, the mechanic from down the street, who stopped by every morning for coffee and a breakfast sandwich, always paying exact change and always asking about my health with genuine concern. Sarah Martinez, the young mother who brought her twin toddlers in for treats and never seemed to mind when they knocked things over or when I slipped them extra cookies. These people weren't just customers. They were the threads that wove together the fabric of my daily existence. They depended on me to keep the store running smoothly, to remember their preferences, to order their favorite items, to be there when they needed something at the last minute. And I depended on them to make me feel valued, to give me purpose, to remind me that I still mattered in this world. Jennifer saw it differently. During her increasingly rare visits home, she'd walk through the store with barely concealed disdain, pointing out outdated inventory systems, inefficient layouts, and what she called missed opportunities for growth. She'd lecture me about online grocery delivery, self-checkout systems, and corporate partnerships that could modernize the operation. What she really meant was that she thought the store was beneath her, a relic of a simpler time that embarrassed her when she had to explain her family background to her sophisticated colleagues. David was kinder, but equally disconnected. He'd praise the store's authentic charm and talk about how refreshing it was to see a local business thriving in a age of corporate chains, but I could tell he saw it as quaint rather than vital. He'd help out when he visited, stocking shelves and chatting with customers, but there was always an air of temporary engagement, like he was playing a role rather than considering a future. The morning of my stroke started like any other. I'd opened the store at 6, the same time I'd been opening it for decades, and was arranging the morning delivery of fresh bread from Morrison's bakery when the world suddenly tilted sideways. One moment I was counting dinner rolls, and the next I was on the floor, my left side completely numb, words scrambling in my mouth like alphabet soup. Mrs. Henderson found me 20 minutes later when she came in for her usual morning coffee. She'd taken one look at me and called 911, then sat beside me on that cold linoleum floor, holding my hand and talking to me in calm, steady tones until the paramedics arrived. The next few days were a blur of tests, consultations, and medical terminology that felt like a foreign language. The doctors explained that I'd suffered a significant ischemic stroke, that there was swelling in my brain, and that they needed to put me in a medically induced coma to give my body time to heal. They were cautiously optimistic about my chances. For recovery, they said, but the next 72 hours would be critical. I remember Jennifer arriving at the hospital in a whirlwind of expensive perfume and barely contained panic, her designer suit looking out of place in the sterile environment of the ICU. I remember David's flight being delayed, and Jennifer's irritation that she had to handle everything alone, at least initially. What I don't remember is the exact moment they sedated me, but I do remember my last conscious thought being gratitude that my children would be there to make decisions for me, to advocate for my care, to ensure that everything possible was being done to help me recover. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I trusted them completely. I trusted Jennifer's intelligence and persistence, and I trusted David's gentleness and intuition. I believed that whatever differences we might have had over the years, whatever disappointments or misunderstandings had accumulated between us, blood was thicker than water, and they would move heaven and earth to bring me back. I was wrong about so many things. The medically induced coma lasted 5 days, though I didn't know that at the time. What I experienced wasn't the peaceful darkness that people often describe, but rather a strange, floating awareness that came and went like waves. Sometimes I felt completely disconnected from my body, as if I was watching everything from a great distance. Other times I was intensely aware of sounds and sensations, but unable to respond to them. I could hear voices, feel touches, sense the presence of people around me, but I couldn't open my eyes or move or speak. During those 5 days, I heard things that were meant to comfort me. Jennifer reading magazine articles aloud in a voice that sounded strained and artificial. David, who had finally arrived, playing soft music from his phone and talking to me about his latest art projects. Nurses discussing my vital signs and medication schedules with professional competence. Dr. Richardson, my neurologist, explaining to my children that my responses were encouraging, that there were signs of improvement, that they should continue to hope for a positive outcome. But I also heard other things. Conversations that took place when people thought I couldn't hear, when they spoke in whispers or stepped just outside my room. Jennifer on the phone with someone she called Richard, discussing her work schedule and how difficult it was to put her life on hold indefinitely. David expressing frustration with Jennifer's attitude, saying she seemed more concerned about inconvenience than about my recovery. And then, gradually, other conversations that made less sense to me at the time, but would later prove to be devastatingly clear. Jennifer talking to someone about arrangements. David asking questions about procedures and timelines. References to a service and flowers that seemed oddly detailed for someone who was supposedly focused on my recovery. At first, I thought I was misunderstanding, that the medications were making me paranoid or confused. But the conversations became more frequent and more specific, and slowly, horribly, I began to realize what I was hearing. My daughter wasn't just preparing for the possibility that I might die. She was actively planning for it, as if my death was not just likely but inevitable, not just probable but scheduled. She was making arrangements for my funeral while I lay unconscious, while doctors were telling her there was reason for hope, while my body was actually showing signs of improvement that she was choosing to ignore. The moment I truly understood what was happening was when I heard her on the phone with Henderson's funeral home, the same place that had handled Patrick's service. She was standing in the hallway just outside my room, speaking in the hushed but businesslike tone she used for all her professional calls. She was discussing dates, asking about availability for the following week, going over menu options for the reception afterward. She talked about flowers as if she was planning a wedding, debating between lilies and roses, asking about seasonal availability and pricing. She mentioned the church, Father McKenna, the organist Mrs. Walsh. She even discussed the obituary, reading portions of it aloud to whoever was on the other end of the line, as if my life story was just another item on her to-do list. The worst part wasn't the practical planning, though that was horrifying enough. The worst part was her tone. There was no grief in her voice, no reluctance or sorrow. She sounded relieved, almost eager, like someone finally checking an unpleasant task off her list. She talked about me as if I was already gone, as if the woman lying in the hospital bed was just a shell waiting for the inevitable conclusion. She referred to my recovery as unlikely and my prognosis as terminal, directly contradicting what the doctors had been telling her just hours earlier. When David questioned her about the timing, suggesting that maybe they should wait until they had more definitive information about my condition, Jennifer's response was swift and sharp. She told him that they needed to be realistic, that they couldn't just wait around indefinitely, that someone had to take charge of the situation. She said that my quality of life would never be the same even if I did recover, that I would probably need constant care, that it would be selfish to hope for a miracle when the practical thing was to accept reality and make the necessary arrangements. But I wasn't dying. Even in my compromised state, I could feel my strength returning gradually. My awareness was becoming clearer, my responses to stimuli were improving, and according to the medical team, my vital signs were stabilizing in encouraging ways. Dr. Richardson had specifically told my children that while my recovery would take time and might not be complete, there was genuine reason for optimism. Yet Jennifer was ignoring all of that, choosing instead to focus on the worst-case scenarios and plan accordingly. It was then that I realized this wasn't just about medical pessimism or protective anxiety. This was about something else entirely. This was about Jennifer seeing an opportunity and seizing it with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to everything else in her life. My death would solve problems for her, simplify her life in ways that my recovery would not. A funeral could be scheduled, executed, and concluded within a week, allowing her to return to her normal routine with minimal disruption. My recovery, on the other hand, would create ongoing obligations, emotional and practical responsibilities. That would interfere with her carefully organized existence. As I lay there, trapped in my unresponsive body but increasingly aware of what was happening around me, I began to understand that my daughter had already written me off. In her mind, I was no longer her mother fighting for life. I was a burden, to be managed, a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be handled as efficiently as possible. The woman who had once been the center of my world, the child I had loved unconditionally from the moment she drew her first breath, had reduced me to a line item in her personal budget of time and energy. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I had ever experienced. This wasn't just about end-of-life planning or difficult medical decisions. This was about my own daughter giving up on me, actively hoping for my death, and taking concrete steps to prepare for a future in which I no longer existed. She wasn't grieving the possibility of losing me. She was anticipating the relief of being free from the obligation of caring about me. And David, sweet David, who had always been my gentle dreamer, was going along with it. Not enthusiastically, not with Jennifer's cold calculation, but going along nonetheless. When he raised concerns about the timing or suggested that maybe they should focus on supporting my recovery instead of planning my funeral, Jennifer would shut him down with lectures about being realistic and responsible. And David, who had always been the peacemaker, who had always deferred to his older sister's stronger personality, would eventually acquiesce. He would nod and agree and participate in conversations about flower arrangements and burial plots, even though I could hear the reluctance in his voice. I wanted to scream, to fight, to somehow break through the prison of my unresponsive body and confront them with the truth of what they were doing. I wanted to grab Jennifer by the shoulders and shake her until she understood that I was still here, still fighting, still very much alive and aware of every cruel word she spoke. I wanted to make David see that his passivity was just as damaging as Jennifer's active betrayal, that his failure to stand up for me was allowing something unconscionable to happen. But I couldn't do any of those things. I could only lie there and listen as my children planned my death while I fought for my life. The planning became more detailed as the days passed. Jennifer contacted my insurance company to inquire about benefits and procedures. She called my bank to ask about account access and estate procedures. She went through my personal papers, which David had retrieved from my house, looking for important documents and contact information. She made lists of people who needed to be notified, planned the logistics of the service, even discussed what I should be buried in. Every conversation was practical, efficient, and completely devoid of genuine emotion. What struck me most was how natural it all seemed to her. This wasn't a woman struggling with difficult decisions or grappling with overwhelming grief. This was someone executing a plan with the same competence she brought to her professional responsibilities. She had deadlines to meet, vendors to coordinate, details to manage. The fact that the event she was planning was the burial of her own mother seemed almost incidental to the process. Meanwhile, the medical team continued to be cautiously optimistic about my progress. Dr. Richardson explained to my children that my brain activity was improving, that my responses to stimuli were becoming more consistent, and that there was a real possibility I could regain consciousness soon. He recommended that they continue talking to me, playing familiar music, reading to me, engaging with me as if I could hear everything they said, because there was substantial evidence that coma patients often retained more awareness than was immediately apparent. Jennifer's response to this news was telling. Instead of feeling hopeful or relieved, she seemed frustrated, almost annoyed. She questioned the doctor about the reliability of his assessments, asked about the possibility of false hope, wanted to know about worst-case scenarios and long-term care requirements. When Dr. Richardson maintained his cautiously positive outlook and encouraged patience, Jennifer's irritation was barely concealed. She needed certainty, preferably the kind of certainty that would allow her to proceed with her plans without interference from inconvenient medical optimism. It was during one of these conversations with Dr. Richardson that I first managed to move. It was barely perceptible, just a slight twitch of my right index finger, but it was deliberate and conscious. I was trying to signal that I could hear, that I was present and aware and fighting to come back. Dr. Richardson noticed immediately and called for additional tests. Jennifer, standing beside my bed, either didn't see the movement or chose to ignore it. Over the next 24 hours, my responses became more frequent and more obvious. I could squeeze hands on command, move my eyes in response to requests, and even make small sounds when prompted. The medical team was thrilled with these developments, calling them excellent signs of neurological recovery. They began talking about reducing my sedation, about the possibility of full consciousness returning within days, about rehabilitation plans and recovery timelines. Jennifer's reaction to these developments was not what a loving daughter's should have been. Instead of joy or relief, she seemed increasingly anxious and agitated. She spent more time on the phone with the funeral home, confirming arrangements and discussing contingency plans. She talked to her employer about extending her leave of absence, but not because she wanted to be there for my recovery. She was trying to buy herself time to manage what she clearly saw as a complicating situation. The final straw came when I heard her talking to someone, I assumed the funeral director, about accelerating the timeline. She was concerned, she said, about developments that might interfere with their plans. She wanted to ensure that everything was in place and ready to proceed as soon as it became appropriate. The clinical detachment in her voice was chilling. She was talking about my death like it was a business transaction that needed to be executed before market conditions changed. That night, as I lay in the darkness listening to the familiar sounds of the hospital, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to recover, not just for my own sake, but to show my children exactly what they had revealed about themselves. I was going to get better, and I was going to attend my own funeral to see firsthand what kind of people my children had become when they thought I couldn't see or hear or judge their actions. The next morning, I opened my eyes for the first time in 6 days. Dr. Richardson was making his rounds, checking my charts and discussing my case with the nurses, when I managed to focus on his face and whisper his name. The medical team was ecstatic. Jennifer, who had been standing in the corner reading her phone, looked up with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. It might have been relief, but it looked more like disappointment, as if my recovery was an inconvenience she hadn't adequately prepared for. Over the next few days, my improvement was rapid and remarkable. My speech returned quickly, my mobility improved daily, and my cognitive function showed no signs of lasting damage. Dr. Richardson called it one of the most impressive stroke recoveries he had seen in his career. The physical therapy team was amazed by my progress. The nurses spoke in terms of miracles and second chances. But I didn't tell anyone what I had heard during my coma. I didn't confront Jennifer about the funeral planning or challenge David about his passive complicity. Instead, I played the role of the grateful recovering patient, expressing wonder at finding myself alive and surrounded by loving family. I thanked Jennifer profusely for staying by my side, praised David for his devotion, and told everyone who would listen how blessed I was to have such caring children. Because I had a plan of my own now, I was going to let them think I knew nothing about what had happened while I was unconscious. I was going to recover fully, return to my normal life, and then I was going to find out exactly what my children had arranged for my departure from this world. And when the time was right, when everything was in place, I was going to give them the surprise of their lives. I was going to attend my own funeral. The rehabilitation process gave me time to think, to plan, and most importantly, to observe. Jennifer visited daily during my first week of recovery, bringing flowers and magazines, sitting beside my bed with what anyone else would have considered devotion. But I could see the calculation behind her concerned expressions, the way she checked her watch during our conversations, the barely concealed frustration when I showed signs of rapid improvement. She would ask the doctors pointed questions about my prognosis, always focusing on potential complications rather than positive developments. When Dr. Richardson mentioned that I might be able to return home within 2 weeks, Jennifer immediately began discussing the challenges of living alone. At my age, the risks of another stroke, the wisdom of considering assisted living options. She wasn't concerned about my well-being. She was concerned about the disruption to her carefully laid plans. David was different, but no less revealing. His guilt was written across his face every time he looked at me. He brought me books and art supplies, spent hours helping me with physical therapy exercises, and listened patiently as I talked about my plans for reopening the store. But there was something hollow about his attention, something that felt like overcompensation. He was trying too hard to be the devoted son, and I understood why. He was trying to make up for what he had allowed to happen, for his failure to protect me when I couldn't protect myself. During my second week in the hospital, I started making my own phone calls. The nurses had given me access to a bedside phone, and I used it strategically. My first call was to Mrs. Henderson, who had found me on the floor of the store. She was overjoyed to hear my voice and immediately began planning to visit, bringing updates about the neighborhood and offers to help with anything I needed. Through Mrs. Henderson, I learned that Jennifer had been telling people I was unlikely to recover fully. She had spoken to several of my regular customers, explaining that the store would probably need to be sold, that I would require long-term care, that the family was preparing for the worst. She had even contacted a commercial real estate agent about evaluating the property, using my condition as justification for exploring options. My second call was to Father McKenna at St. Mary's, the church where Patrick and I had been married, where my children had been baptized, where Patrick's funeral had been held. Father McKenna was delighted to hear from me and mentioned, almost casually, that Jennifer had spoken to him about scheduling a service. When I pressed for details, he seemed confused, saying he had assumed it was preliminary planning, the kind that families sometimes did when facing uncertainty. But the specifics Jennifer had discussed, the dates she had proposed, the readings she had selected, were far too detailed for preliminary planning. My third call was to Henderson's funeral home. I spoke to Robert Henderson Jr., whose father had handled Patrick's arrangements. I explained that I was calling to clarify some confusion about arrangements that might have been discussed on my behalf. Robert was clearly uncomfortable, mentioning that they had indeed spoken with my daughter about services, but that he had assumed it was contingency planning. When I asked about specific details, he admitted that deposits had been placed, flowers had been ordered, and a date had been reserved. The picture that emerged from these calls was worse than I had imagined. Jennifer hadn't just been planning my funeral as a precaution. She had been actively preparing for it, making financial commitments and scheduling arrangements as if my death was imminent and certain. She had told my community that I was dying, had begun the process of dismantling my life, and had done it, all while maintaining the facade of the concerned daughter. But I also discovered something else through these calls, something that would become crucial to my plans. Jennifer had made a significant mistake in her calculations. In her eagerness to manage my death efficiently, she had revealed her true priorities to people who had known me for decades, people who cared about me genuinely and were disturbed by what they had heard. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that Jennifer's attitude had struck her as odd, too businesslike for someone facing the loss of a parent. Father McKenna admitted that he had been troubled by Jennifer's lack of emotional response when discussing the funeral arrangements, her focus on logistics rather than grief. Robert Henderson Jr. had been so uncomfortable with the advanced planning. that he had actually tried to discourage Jennifer from making definitive arrangements while I was still fighting for recovery. My community, the people who had supported me through Patrick's death and had rallied around me during my crisis, were already questioning Jennifer's motives. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but they sensed that something was wrong. That gave me an advantage I hadn't expected. When the time came to reveal the truth, I wouldn't be facing skeptical strangers. I would be speaking to people who were already concerned about Jennifer's behavior. During my 3rd week in the hospital, I began making more strategic calls. I contacted my lawyer, Harold Brennan, who had handled all of my business and personal legal matters since Patrick's death. Harold was relieved to hear from me and immediately offered to come to the hospital to discuss my affairs. When he arrived, I was careful to present myself as the concerned mother planning for her family's future, not as someone who had uncovered a betrayal. I told Harold that my brush with death had made me realize I needed to update my will and clarify my intentions regarding the store and my other assets. I mentioned that Jennifer seemed to have concerns about my ability to manage my affairs independently, and that I wanted to ensure everything was clearly documented to avoid any confusion or family conflict. Harold nodded understandingly, familiar with the complexities that could arise when adult children began questioning their parents' competence. What I didn't tell Harold was that I had already decided to change my will dramatically. The document that currently existed left everything to Jennifer and David equally, with the assumption that they would work together to maintain the store or sell it responsibly if necessary. That will had been written when I still believed my children were the people I had raised them to be, when I trusted them to honor my wishes and preserve what Patrick and I had built. Now I knew better. Now I understood that Jennifer saw my legacy as nothing more than assets to be liquidated, and David lacked the backbone to oppose her. The new will I was planning would reflect that understanding, but I couldn't reveal my intentions. Yet, I needed time to document everything that had happened, to gather evidence of Jennifer's actions, and to prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably come. My 4th week in the hospital was when I began setting the trap. I started talking to Jennifer and David about my plans for the future, carefully gauging their reactions and planting seeds that would later grow into their downfall. I mentioned to Jennifer that I was considering making some changes to my will. Nothing dramatic, just some clarifications to ensure my wishes were understood. I could see the immediate interest in her eyes, the calculation as she tried to determine what those changes might mean for her. I told David that I was thinking about expanding the store, maybe adding a small cafe or partnering with local farmers to sell fresh produce. I talked about wanting to create something that could provide jobs for young people in the community, something that could be a lasting contribution to Millbrook. David seemed genuinely interested in these ideas, but I could also see the concern in his eyes as he realized that my recovery and renewed ambition would complicate whatever arrangements had been made. Most importantly, I began talking about my funeral. I mentioned to both of them that my experience in the coma had given me thoughts about mortality, about how I wanted to be remembered, about what kind of service I would want when my time eventually came. I watched their faces carefully as I spoke, noting the flashes of panic, the quick exchanges of glances, the obvious discomfort as they realized I was discussing something they had already planned in detail. I told them I had been thinking about having a celebration of life rather than a traditional funeral, something that reflected my personality and values. I mentioned wanting to have the service at the community center rather than the church, wanting to serve food from local restaurants rather than the standard funeral reception, wanting to have people share stories and memories rather than formal eulogies. Every detail I mentioned was different from what I knew they had already arranged, and I could see the growing horror in Jennifer's eyes as she realized the extent of the changes that would be necessary. But I also did something else during these conversations. I made it clear that I was planning to live for many more years, that I was looking forward to returning to work, that I had no intention of slowing down or stepping back from my responsibilities. I talked about projects I wanted to complete, places I wanted to travel, experiences I wanted to have. I painted a picture of a vibrant future that directly contradicted the narrative Jennifer had been telling everyone about my declining health and diminished capacity. By the end of my 4th week in the hospital, I was ready to be discharged. My recovery had exceeded all medical expectations, and Dr. Richardson was calling me his miracle patient. My physical therapy was complete. My cognitive function was perfect, and my independence was fully restored. There was no medical reason for me to remain in the hospital, and the insurance company was eager to end their financial responsibility for my care. Jennifer was not happy about my discharge. She had been hoping, I realized, that I would require extended care, that there would be complications that would justify the narrative she had created about my condition. When Dr. Richardson announced that I could go home, Jennifer immediately began questioning the wisdom of that decision. She wanted to know about follow-up care, about the risks of living alone, about what would happen if I had another stroke. Dr. Richardson was patient, but firm. He explained that I had made a remarkable recovery, that my risk factors were being managed with medication, and that there was no medical justification for restricting my independence. He recommended that I continue with outpatient physical therapy and regular checkups, but emphasized that I was cleared to resume all normal activities, including running my store. That evening, Jennifer asked to speak with me privately. She closed the door to my hospital room and sat down beside my bed with the expression she had always worn when she was about to tell me something I wouldn't want to hear. She said she had been thinking about my situation, about the challenges I would face living alone at my age, about the responsibilities of running a business after such a serious health scare. She suggested that maybe it was time for me to consider retiring, selling the store, and moving into a senior living community where I would have support and companionship. She mentioned a lovely facility she had researched, Sunset Manor, that offered independent living with the option of additional care as needed. She had already spoken to their admissions coordinator, she said, and they had availability for immediate move-in. I listened to her pitch with the expression of a grateful mother considering wise advice from a concerned daughter. I asked thoughtful questions about the facility, about the costs, about the logistics of selling the store. I even allowed myself to seem slightly overwhelmed by the decisions I would need to make, giving Jennifer the impression that she was successfully persuading me to consider her suggestions. But what I was really doing was gathering more evidence of her betrayal. Every word she spoke revealed her true agenda. She wasn't concerned about my well-being. She was concerned about managing the inconvenience of my recovery. She had expected me to die or to be sufficiently incapacitated that she could make decisions for me. My full recovery had disrupted her plans, and now she was scrambling to achieve the same outcome through manipulation and pressure. David was present for part of this conversation, though he said very little. I could see the conflict in his face as Jennifer outlined her suggestions. He clearly understood that Jennifer was trying to push me into decisions that served her interests, rather than mine, but he also seemed unable or unwilling to challenge her directly. His silence was its own form of betrayal, a passive acceptance of Jennifer's attempts to control my life. When Jennifer finished her presentation, I thanked her for her concern and told her I would think carefully about everything she had said. I mentioned that such important decisions shouldn't be rushed, that I wanted to return home first and see how I felt about resuming my normal routine. Jennifer's frustration was visible, but she couldn't push too aggressively without revealing her true motives. That night, alone in my hospital room for the last time, I finalized my plan. I had gathered enough information to understand exactly what my children had done and what they were continuing to try to do. I had identified the people in my community who were already suspicious of Jennifer's behavior and who would be willing to support me when the truth came out. I had prepared the legal framework for protecting my assets and my independence. Most importantly, I had decided exactly how I was going to expose Jennifer's betrayal. I wasn't going to confront her privately or try to shame her into better behavior. I was going to let her continue with her plans, encourage her to move forward with the arrangements she had made, and then reveal the truth in the most public and devastating way possible. I was going to attend my own funeral, and I was going to make sure everyone in Millbrook understood exactly what kind of person my daughter really was. The next morning, I was discharged from the hospital with a clean bill of health and a heart full of cold determination. Jennifer drove me home, keeping up a steady stream of conversation about her concerns and suggestions. She pointed out how difficult it would be for me to manage the stairs in my house, how isolated I would be without neighbors nearby, how challenging it would be to reopen the store without help. I nodded and murmured agreement, playing the role of the uncertain elderly woman who was beginning to doubt her own capabilities. I let Jennifer believe she was making progress, that her arguments were having their intended effect. What she didn't realize was that every word she spoke was digging her grave deeper. When we arrived at my house, the house where Patrick and I had lived for 45 years, where I had raised my children and built my life, I was struck by how different it felt. It looked exactly the same, but my perspective had changed completely. This was no longer just my home. It was the stage where the final act of my plan would unfold. Jennifer helped me settle in, unpacking my things and making sure I had everything I needed. She had stocked the refrigerator with groceries and arranged for a home health aide to check on me daily, despite my protests that such assistance was unnecessary. She was building a case, I realized, for my incompetence and need for supervision. Before she left, Jennifer mentioned that she would be staying in town for a few more days to make sure I was adjusting well to being home. She was taking a room at the Millbrook Inn, she said, so she would be close by if I needed anything. What she didn't say, but what I understood, was that she was staying to continue pressuring me about the senior living facility and to monitor my condition for any signs of decline that could support her narrative. After Jennifer left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the familiar comfort of my possessions and began making the phone calls that would set the final phase of my plan in motion. The first call was to Harold Brennan, asking him to come to my house the next day to finalize the changes to my will. The second call was to the bank, confirming my appointments to review my accounts and discuss my financial planning. The third call was to Henderson's funeral home, where I had some very specific questions about the arrangements that had been made on my behalf. Over the next 3 days, while Jennifer believed she was gradually convincing me to accept her suggestions, I was actually preparing for her destruction. I documented every conversation we had, recording her attempts to manipulate me into giving up my independence. I gathered statements from the people she had misled about my condition. I prepared legal documents that would protect my assets from any future attempts at manipulation or exploitation. Most importantly, I confirmed the details of my own funeral. The service was scheduled for the following Saturday at St. Mary's Church, with burial to follow at Millbrook Cemetery. The flowers had been ordered, the reception had been planned, and the obituary had been written. Everything was in place for my departure from this world, except for one small detail that Jennifer had overlooked. I wasn't actually dead. Saturday. Morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes everything seem sharper, more vivid. I had been awake since 4, sitting by my bedroom window watching the sun rise over Millbrook, knowing that this would be the day everything changed. At 8:30, I would officially be dead according to the obituary that had run in yesterday's newspaper. At 10, my funeral service would begin at St. Mary's Church. At 11:30, my body would be lowered into the ground beside Patrick's grave. The only problem with this carefully orchestrated schedule was that I was very much alive, sitting in my kitchen drinking coffee and putting the finishing touches on what would be the most important performance of my life. Jennifer had called me the night before, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but actually to gauge whether I had seen the obituary. She had sounded nervous, talking too quickly about how newspaper errors happen sometimes, how these things got submitted accidentally, how I shouldn't worry about what people might think. I had played my part perfectly, expressing confusion and mild distress about the mistake, allowing Jennifer to comfort me with promises that she would handle everything, that I shouldn't concern myself with such details. What Jennifer didn't know was that I had written the obituary myself. 3 days earlier, I had called the newspaper directly and submitted a revised version of the death notice Jennifer had prepared. The obituary that ran in the Millbrook Gazette was accurate in every detail except one crucial fact: the subject was still breathing. It described my life accurately: my marriage to Patrick, my children, my 40 years of running Sullivan's Corner Market, my contributions to the community. It mentioned my recent battle with stroke and praised my strength and resilience. It invited the community to celebrate my life and legacy at a service that would indeed take place exactly as advertised. The obituary also included one paragraph that Jennifer had not written, a paragraph that would prove significant before the day was over. Margaret was known throughout Millbrook for her kindness, her integrity, and her unwavering devotion to family. She believed that true character was revealed not in times of comfort, but in moments of crisis, when people showed who they really were. She lived her life according to the principle that love must be earned through actions, not claimed. Through blood relation, she hoped that those who survived her would honor her memory by treating others with the same honesty and respect she had tried to show throughout her life. By 7:30, I was dressed in the navy blue dress I had worn to Patrick's funeral. The one Jennifer had suggested would be appropriate for me to be buried in. My hair was styled the way I had always worn it to church, and I had applied makeup carefully, wanting to look my best for what would certainly be the most memorable church service in Millbrook's recent history. I had spent the previous week making careful preparations that went far beyond simply planning to attend my own funeral. I had documented everything, creating a detailed timeline of Jennifer's actions from the moment I entered the hospital until the present day. I had recorded several of our recent conversations using a small digital recorder that Harold Brennan had provided. I had gathered written statements from Mrs. Henderson, Father McKenna, and Robert Henderson Jr. about their interactions with Jennifer regarding my condition and the funeral arrangements. Most importantly, I had prepared a complete financial accounting that would demonstrate exactly what Jennifer's plan would have cost me and my estate. The funeral arrangements alone totaled nearly $15,000, money that would have come from my accounts after my death. But Jennifer's scheme went much deeper than funeral expenses. Through my investigation, I had discovered that she had also contacted my insurance company about death benefits, had spoken to a real estate appraiser about the value of my house and store, and had even begun preliminary discussions with an estate sale company about disposing of my personal belongings. The scope of her planning was breathtaking in its thoroughness and chilling in its implications. She hadn't just hoped for my death. She had created a comprehensive business plan for profiting from it. Every detail had been considered, every asset had been evaluated, every potential source of revenue had been identified and prepared for exploitation. She had treated my death not as a family tragedy, but as a financial opportunity to be maximized through careful preparation and efficient execution. At 8 o'clock, I called Mrs. Henderson and asked if she could give me a ride to church. I explained that I was feeling well enough to attend Sunday service and thought it would be good for me to get back into my normal routine. Mrs. Henderson was delighted to help, though she seemed puzzled by my request to arrive at the church early and to use the side entrance rather than the main doors. I told her I preferred to avoid a crowd while I was still recovering my strength, and she accepted this explanation without question. What Mrs. Henderson didn't know was that I had arranged with Father McKenna to enter the church through his private office, where I would wait until the appropriate moment to make my appearance. Father McKenna had been initially resistant to my plan, concerned about the shock it might cause and the potential for medical complications if the stress proved too much for my recovering system. But when I showed him the evidence of what Jennifer had done, when I explained the depth of her betrayal and the need for public accountability, he had agreed to help. Father McKenna understood better than most how betrayal within families could poison entire communities. He had counseled too many people through the aftermath of greed and manipulation disguised as love. He had seen how the damage extended beyond The immediate victims to affect everyone who had believed in the false narrative. Everyone who had been manipulated into participating in something that served evil purposes while appearing to be acts of kindness and concern. As Mrs. Henderson drove me to St. Mary's, I could see the early arrivals beginning to gather in the church parking lot. I recognized most of the faces, people who had been part of my life for decades, people who had shopped at my store, who had attended church with Patrick and me, who had supported me through his death and celebrated with me during good times. These people were here because they cared about me, because they wanted to honor my memory and support my family in their grief. The knowledge that these good people had been manipulated into participating in Jennifer's deception added another layer of anger to my determination. Jennifer hadn't just betrayed me, she had used my friends and neighbors as unwitting accomplices in her scheme. She had exploited their genuine affection for me to create a public performance that served her private agenda. Every person who had brought flowers, every person who had prepared food for the reception, every person who had arranged their schedule to attend my funeral had been manipulated by someone who saw their kindness as nothing more than useful tools. Father McKenna met us at the side door and escorted me to his office, where I would wait until the service began. Through his window, I could see the parking lot filling with cars, the steady stream of mourners entering the church, the florists, van delivering the elaborate arrangements that Jennifer had ordered. The sight was surreal, watching the preparations for my own funeral while sitting very much alive just 50 feet away from where my empty casket would soon be displayed. At 9:15, Jennifer arrived with David, both dressed in appropriate funeral attire and wearing expressions of dignified grief. I watched them greet the mourners, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of people who had done this before. Jennifer was particularly impressive in her performance, displaying just the right combination of sorrow and strength, gratitude for the support and composure in the face of loss. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have been moved by her apparent devotion. David seemed less comfortable with the performance, though he was playing his part adequately. He accepted hugs and handshakes, nodded at expressions of sympathy, and managed to maintain the appearance of a grieving son. But I could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes darted around the gathering crowd, the nervous energy that suggested he was struggling with what he knew was happening. At 9:30, the funeral director arrived with the hearse, followed by a long black limousine that would transport my children to the cemetery after the service. The hearse was impressive, exactly the kind of vehicle that Jennifer would have selected to make an appropriate impression. Everything about the day's arrangements reflected her taste and her understanding of what would be considered proper and respectful by the community. But there was no casket in the hearse. Jennifer had arranged for a memorial service rather than a traditional funeral, explaining to the funeral director that my body had been donated to medical research at my own request. This was a lie, of course, but it solved the obvious problem of holding a funeral without a corpse. The memorial service would focus on celebrating my life rather than viewing my remains, which was actually perfect for what I had planned. At 9:45, Father McKenna joined me in his office to review the final details of our plan. He would conduct the service normally until the time came for eulogies, at which point he would invite anyone who wished to share memories or thoughts to come forward. Jennifer had prepared remarks, as had David and several community members. After the planned speakers had finished, Father McKenna would make a special announcement about an unexpected final tribute, and that would be my cue to enter. The plan was simple, but the execution would require perfect timing and considerable courage. I would be walking into a room full of people who believed I was dead, people who were there to mourn my passing and support my grieving children. The yet some shock of my appearance would be enormous, and the aftermath would be unlike anything Millbrook had ever experienced. At 10 o'clock, the church bells began to toll, signaling the start of the service. Through Father McKenna's window, I could see the last stragglers hurrying into the building, eager not to miss the beginning of what everyone expected to be a moving tribute to my life and legacy. The parking lot was fuller than I had seen it, for any service other than Christmas and Easter, a testament to the number of people whose lives I had touched during my 73 years in this community. Father McKenna squeezed my hand gently before leaving his office to begin the service. He had prepared special readings for the occasion, selections that would take on additional meaning when the truth was revealed. The opening hymn was Amazing Grace, a song that had always been one of my favorites, and that would prove prophetic in ways the congregation couldn't yet imagine. I listened through the office door as Father McKenna delivered the opening prayers and began his remarks about the nature of life and death, about the ways people live on through their impact on others, about the importance of truth and integrity in all human relationships. His words were carefully chosen to prepare the congregation for what was coming, though no one could have guessed the specific revelation that awaited them. The first speaker was Mayor Patricia Walsh, who had known me since childhood and who spoke movingly about my contributions to Millbrook's economic and social fabric. She praised my integrity, my generosity, and my commitment to treating everyone with fairness and respect regardless of their circumstances. She mentioned specific instances of my kindness, times when I had extended credit to families in crisis, when I had donated food and supplies to people in need, when I had used my position in the community to advocate for positive changes. The second speaker was Dr. Richardson, who had requested permission to attend despite not being a member of our church. He spoke about my remarkable recovery, about the strength and determination I had shown during my medical crisis, about the inspiration my resilience had provided to his medical team. He mentioned how rare it was to see someone overcome such significant health challenges with such grace and positivity, and he expressed his gratitude for having been part of my care team. Dr. Richardson's remarks created an interesting tension in the room as he was essentially praising my fight for life at a service that was supposedly mourning my death. I could imagine Jennifer's discomfort as the doctor spoke about my vitality and my determination to recover, qualities that seemed inconsistent with someone who had supposedly succumbed to her medical condition. The third speaker was Tom Bradley, the mechanic who had been buying coffee and breakfast from my store for over 20 years. Tom was not comfortable with public speaking, but his genuine emotion was evident as he talked about the small kindnesses that had meant so much to him over the years. He mentioned how I had always remembered his children's names, how I had sent flowers when his wife was in the hospital, how I had been one of the first people to congratulate him when he opened his own garage. Tom's speech was particularly powerful because it highlighted the difference between genuine care and performed concern. His awkward but heartfelt words contrasted sharply with Jennifer's polished performance, demonstrating the difference between authentic emotion and calculated manipulation. At 10:30, Jennifer rose to deliver her prepared eulogy. She walked to the podium with composure and dignity, every inch the devoted daughter paying final tribute to her beloved mother. Her speech was beautifully written and expertly delivered, full of touching anecdotes about our relationship and moving reflections on my character and values. She spoke about growing up in my store, about learning the value of hard work and service to others from my example. She mentioned family traditions, holiday celebrations, and quiet moments of connection between mother and daughter. She praised my strength during Patrick's illness and death, my courage in facing my own health challenges, and my grace in accepting the limitations that age and illness had imposed upon my life. Jennifer's eulogy was so convincing, so filled with apparent love and genuine grief, that I found myself momentarily questioning my own perceptions. Could someone who spoke so beautifully about love and family values really be capable of the betrayal I had witnessed? Could the woman delivering this moving tribute really be the same person who had planned my funeral while I fought for my life? But then Jennifer began to talk about my final days, about my acceptance of my mortality and my peace with leaving this world behind. She described conversations we had supposedly had about my readiness to join Patrick, about my concern for her, and David's future happiness, about my gratitude for the life I had been given and my willingness to let go when the time came. Every word of this portion of her eulogy was a lie. We had never had such conversations, because I had never been ready to die, never been at peace with leaving my life behind, never expressed gratitude for anything other than my recovery and return to health. Jennifer was creating a fictional narrative that served her purposes, painting me as someone who had welcomed death rather than someone who had fought against it with every ounce of strength I possessed. As Jennifer concluded her remarks and returned to her seat, I could see tears in the eyes of many congregation members. Her performance had been flawless, her deception complete. She had successfully convinced an entire community that she was the grieving daughter of a woman who had died peacefully after expressing her love and gratitude for the family that would carry on her legacy. David's eulogy was shorter and less polished than Jennifer's, but it was no less manipulative. He spoke about my artistic sensibilities, about how I had encouraged his creativity even when it led him away from the family business. He mentioned my support for his unconventional career choices, my understanding of his need to find his own path in life, my pride in his accomplishments even when they differed from what she and Patrick had originally envisioned for him. David's speech was more genuinely emotional than Jennifer's, and I could tell that some of what he said came from real memories and authentic feelings. But he also participated in the same fictional narrative that Jennifer had created, describing a peaceful death and a mother who had been ready to let go of life. His complicity in the deception was perhaps more painful than Jennifer's active manipulation because it represented the betrayal of someone who had genuinely loved me but had lacked the courage to protect me when protection was needed. After David returned to his seat, Father McKenna announced that the service would conclude with a final hymn and closing prayers. But then he paused, looking out over the congregation with an expression that suggested something unexpected was about to happen. "Before we close this service," Father McKenna said, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "I have been asked to share one final tribute to Margaret Sullivan. This tribute comes from someone who knew her better than anyone else in this room, someone who understood her heart and her character more deeply than the rest of us could imagine." The congregation stirred with interest, wondering who this mysterious final speaker might be. I imagined Jennifer and David exchanging glances, trying to determine what Father McKenna might have planned that they hadn't been informed about. "This final tribute," Father McKenna continued, "comes from Margaret herself." The confusion in the room was palpable. People began whispering to each other, trying to understand what Father McKenna meant. Had I left behind a written message? Had I recorded something before my death? Jennifer's face had gone pale, and I could see her hands gripping the edge of the pew as she tried to process what was happening. Margaret wanted to attend her own funeral, Father McKenna said, his voice growing stronger as he delivered the words we had rehearsed. She wanted to hear what people would say about her life. She wanted to see who would come to honor her memory, and most importantly, she wanted to witness how her family would represent her character and values to the community she loved. The whispers in the congregation grew louder as people struggled to understand what they were hearing. Some looked confused, others looked concerned, and a few were beginning to look suspicious as they realized that something very unusual was happening. "Margaret Sullivan is not dead," Father McKenna announced, his words falling into the church, like stones into still water. "She recovered from her stroke completely. She has been living independently in her own home for the past 2 weeks, and she is here with us today to see exactly what kind of funeral her daughter planned for her, while she was unconscious and fighting for her life." The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if the entire congregation had stopped breathing simultaneously, as if time itself had paused to absorb the impossibility of what they had just heard. Then Father McKenna gestured toward his office door, and I stepped into the sanctuary. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Several people gasped audibly, others cried out in shock, and at least 3 elderly congregation members appeared to be in danger of fainting. Mrs. Henderson stood up so quickly that she knocked over her purse, spilling its contents across the floor. Tom Bradley's mouth fell open so wide that he looked like a cartoon character. Mayor Walsh grabbed the back of the pew in front of her, as if she needed physical support to remain upright. But it was Jennifer's reaction that I focused on as I walked slowly down the center aisle toward the front of the church. Her face had gone from pale to gray, and she was staring at me as if I were actually a ghost rather than a living woman. Her carefully composed expression had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked like pure terror. David's reaction was different but equally revealing. He buried his face in his hands and began to shake, whether from relief or shame or fear, I couldn't tell. But his response suggested that he understood immediately what my appearance meant, not just for the current moment, but for everything that would follow. As I reached the front of the church, I turned to face the congregation, many of whom were still struggling to process what they were seeing. Some were beginning to smile as the joy of my survival overcame their shock. Others looked confused and concerned, uncertain about what was happening or what it meant. A few looked angry, as if they resented being deceived regardless of the circumstances. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the church's excellent acoustics. "Thank you all for coming to my funeral. I apologize for any inconvenience my continued existence may cause." A nervous laugh rippled through the congregation, though the tension in the room remained thick enough to cut with a knife. "I want to thank Father McKenna for allowing me to attend this service," I continued. "And I want to thank all of you for the kind words you've shared about my life and character. It's not often that someone gets to hear their own eulogy, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to understand how my friends and neighbors see me." I paused, looking directly at Jennifer, who was still staring at me with that expression of terrified disbelief. "I'm especially grateful," I said, "for the opportunity to hear how my children would represent me to this community after my death. I've learned things about my family today that I never could have discovered any other way." The congregation was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that went far beyond a simple case of mistaken death reports. They could sense the undercurrents of conflict and revelation, even if they didn't yet understand the specific details. 3 weeks ago, I continued, I suffered a stroke and was placed in a medically induced coma. During that time, while I was unconscious but still aware, I learned that my daughter Jennifer had begun planning my funeral. Not as a precaution or preparation for a possible outcome, but as a definite event with specific dates, arrangements, and financial commitments. The murmurs in the congregation grew louder as people began to grasp the implications of what I was saying. Jennifer told this community that I was dying, that my recovery was unlikely, that plans needed to be made for my death and burial. She contacted my insurance company. She spoke to real estate appraisers about my property. She made arrangements with estate sale companies about disposing of my belongings. She did all of this while doctors were telling her that my prognosis was positive, that my recovery was proceeding well, that there was genuine reason for optimism. I could see Jennifer trying to compose herself, trying to find words to respond to my accusations. But before she could speak, I continued. The obituary that appeared in yesterday's newspaper was not the result of a clerical error, as Jennifer told me. It was submitted deliberately, as part of arrangements that had been in place for over a week. The funeral service we are attending today was planned and paid for before I had even regained consciousness. Now the congregation was fully engaged, hanging on every word as they realized they were witnessing a family drama unlike anything they had ever experienced. "I want to be very clear about what happened," I said, my voice growing stronger as I delivered the words I had been rehearsing for days. My daughter did not plan my funeral because she thought I was dying. She planned my funeral because she wanted me to die. She saw my stroke not as a tragedy to be overcome, but as an opportunity to be seized. She viewed my potential death not as a loss to be mourned, but as a problem to be solved. Jennifer finally found her voice. "Mother, that's not true. said, her words carrying clearly through the silent church. You're confused. You're not remembering things correctly. Your illness, the medications, they've affected your thinking. It was exactly the response I had expected. The attempt to paint me as mentally compromised, unreliable, unable to accurately perceive or report what had happened to me. I recorded our conversations, Jennifer, I said calmly. I have documentation of every arrangement you made, every lie you told, every step you took to prepare for my death while I was fighting for my life. I have witnesses who can testify about what you told them regarding my condition and prognosis. I gestured toward Mrs. Henderson, toward Father McKenna, toward others in the congregation who had interacted with Jennifer during my hospitalization. Mrs. Henderson, would you please tell the congregation what Jennifer told you about my condition when you called to ask about visiting me in the hospital? Mrs. Henderson stood slowly, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot, but unable to refuse my request. She said you were very sick, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice shaking slightly. She said you probably wouldn't recover, that your brain had been damaged, that even if you survived, you would need constant care. She said the family was preparing for the worst. Father McKenna, I continued, would you please share with the congregation the details of the funeral arrangements Jennifer made with you? Father McKenna nodded gravely. Jennifer contacted me 8 days ago to schedule a funeral service. She provided specific details about readings, music, and the order of service. She made arrangements for today's date specifically, and she placed a deposit to secure the church for this time. When I suggested that perhaps we should wait for more definitive information about your condition, she insisted that the arrangements needed to be finalized because she had to return to her work obligations. The evidence was mounting, and I could see that the congregation was beginning to understand the scope of Jennifer's deception. But I wasn't finished. Robert Henderson, Jr. Are you here today? I asked, scanning the congregation. Robert stood from his seat near the back of the church. Yes, Mrs. Sullivan. Would you please tell everyone about the funeral arrangements your establishment made on my behalf? Robert's discomfort was obvious, but he spoke clearly. Jennifer contacted us 9 days ago to arrange for a memorial service and burial. She selected a casket, arranged for flowers, planned a reception, and made a significant deposit. She insisted that the arrangements be finalized quickly because she needed to coordinate with other family obligations. When I suggested that perhaps we should wait until your condition was more stable, she became quite firm about proceeding with the planning. And what was the total cost of these arrangements? I asked. $14,800, Robert replied. A gasp went through the congregation at the amount, but I continued my questioning. Did Jennifer at any time express uncertainty about whether these arrangements would be needed? Did she suggest that they were contingency plans in case I didn't recover? Robert shook his head. No, ma'am. She spoke about the arrangements as definite plans for a specific date. She seemed very certain that the service would take place as scheduled. Now I turned my attention to David, who was still sitting with his face in his hands. David, I said, my voice gentle but firm. Did you know about these arrangements? David looked up at me with eyes that were red with tears. Yes, he whispered. Did you agree with Jennifer's decision to plan my funeral while I was still fighting? For recovery? David's struggle was visible to everyone in the church. I didn't know what to do, he said, his voice breaking. Jennifer said the doctors were being unrealistic, that we needed to be practical. I didn't want to plan your funeral, but I didn't know how to stop her. Did you believe I was dying, David? I hoped you weren't, he said, tears flowing freely now. But Jennifer seemed so certain, and she knows more about these things than I do. I thought maybe she understood something about your condition that I didn't. It was a heartbreaking admission of weakness, but it was also an acknowledgement of complicity. David's passivity had enabled Jennifer's betrayal, and his failure to advocate for me had contributed to the pain I had experienced. Now I addressed the congregation directly, speaking to the friends and neighbors who had been manipulated into participating in Jennifer's deception. "I want you all to understand," I said, "that you have done nothing wrong. You came here today because you cared about me, because you wanted to honor my memory and support my family. Jennifer exploited your kindness and your genuine affection for me to create this elaborate performance. You were not willing participants in her deception. You were victims of it." The anger in the room was becoming palpable, but it was not directed at me. People were beginning to understand how they had been used, how their emotions and their time and their resources had been manipulated by someone who saw their compassion as nothing more than useful tools for her personal agenda. But I also want you to understand why I chose to reveal the truth in this way, in front of all of you, rather than handling this as a private family matter. I paused, gathering my thoughts for the most important part of my statement. Betrayal within families is not just a private tragedy. It affects entire communities. When someone lies about life and death, when someone exploits the grief and compassion of others for personal gain, the damage extends far beyond the immediate family. Jennifer didn't just betray me. She betrayed all of you. She used your love for me as a weapon against me, and she used your trust in her as a shield for her deception. The congregation was completely silent now, hanging on every word as I delivered the conclusion of my revelation. I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what happened here, so that you can make informed decisions about what kind of people you choose to trust, what kind of behavior you choose to support, and what kind of community you choose to be part of. Now I turned back to Jennifer, who had been sitting in stunned silence during my entire presentation. "Jennifer, you have 30 seconds to explain to this congregation why you planned my funeral while I was fighting for my life. You have 30 seconds to justify why you lied to my friends and neighbors about my condition. You have 30 seconds to account for the $14,000 you spent preparing for my death, while doctors were optimistic about my recovery." Jennifer stood slowly, her composure finally returning as she realized that attack might be her best defense. "Mother, you're clearly suffering from post-stroke cognitive impairment," she said, her voice taking on the professional tone she used in her pharmaceutical sales career. "These paranoid delusions, these conspiracy theories, they're common symptoms of the kind of brain injury you experienced. Everyone in this room needs to understand that you're not thinking clearly, that your perception of events has been distorted by your medical condition." It was a calculated response, designed to discredit my testimony by suggesting that I was mentally incompetent. But I had been prepared for exactly this line of defense. "Harold Brennan, are you here today?" I asked. My lawyer stood from his odd seat in the middle of the church. "Yes, Margaret." "Harold, did you conduct a competency evaluation of me yesterday as I requested?" "Yes, I did. Along with Dr. Richardson and Dr. Patricia Myers, the neuropsychologist. We administered comprehensive tests of your cognitive function, your memory, your reasoning ability, and your mental status." "And what were the results of those tests?" "You scored above average in all categories. There is no evidence of cognitive impairment, memory loss, or any other mental deficits related to your stroke. You are fully competent to make decisions about your affairs and to provide reliable testimony about your experiences." Harold's statement effectively destroyed Jennifer's attempt to portray me as mentally incompetent, but I wasn't finished with my evidence. "Harold, would you please play the recording I provided to you yesterday?" Harold produced a small digital recorder and pressed the play button. Jennifer's voice filled the church, crystal clear and unmistakably her own, as she discussed funeral arrangements with Henderson's funeral home. The recording captured her businesslike tone, her specific requests, her insistence on immediate action, and most damaging, her statement that the old woman won't be a problem much longer. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. There was no denying the evidence, no explaining away the cold calculation in Jennifer's voice, no justifying the callous reference to me as the old woman who would soon be disposed of. Jennifer's face had gone from gray to white, and she was gripping the back of the pew so tightly that her knuckles had turned bloodless. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "I think we've heard enough," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "Jennifer, I want you to leave this church, leave this town, and never contact me again. You are no longer my daughter. You are a stranger who exploited my illness for your own gain, who lied to my community about my condition, who planned to profit from my death while I fought for my life." Jennifer found her voice at last. "You can't do this," she said, her composure finally cracking completely. "I'm your daughter. This is my inheritance, my family, my future. You can't just cut me off because you're angry about some misunderstanding." "This wasn't a misunderstanding," I replied. "This was a calculated betrayal, and you're wrong about your inheritance. Yesterday, I executed a new will that leaves everything to the Millbrook Community Foundation, with specific instructions that the money be used to support families facing medical crises. You will inherit nothing from me except the knowledge that your greed and cruelty have been exposed to everyone who matters in your life." The finality of my statement seemed to break something in Jennifer. She began to sob, not the controlled tears of a grieving daughter, but the desperate wails of someone who had lost everything and understood that her actions had consequences she hadn't anticipated. "Please," she begged, reaching toward me. "I made a mistake. I was scared. I was overwhelmed. I didn't know what I was doing. Please don't do this to me." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The woman who had referred to me as the old woman, who wouldn't be a problem much longer, had forfeited any claim to my compassion or forgiveness. "David," I said, turning to my son, "you have a choice to make. You can continue to enable Jennifer's behavior by remaining silent and passive, or you can acknowledge what happened here and commit to being a better person going forward. But you cannot have both. You cannot claim to love me while allowing others to abuse me." David looked at me with tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to stop it. I was afraid of confronting Jennifer, afraid of making things worse." "Your fear made things worse," I replied. "Your silence enabled abuse. But unlike Jennifer, you at least seem to understand that what happened was wrong. If you want to remain my son, you'll need to prove that you can be trusted to protect me rather than protect your own comfort." David nodded, unable to speak through his tears. Now I address the congregation one final time. "I want to thank all of you for being here today, not just for the funeral you thought you were attending, but for witnessing the truth about what happened to me and what kind of people my children revealed themselves to be when they thought no one was watching." I paused, looking around the church at faces that showed a mixture of shock, anger, relief, and admiration. I hope that what you've seen here today will remind you that family relationships, like all relationships, must be based on mutual respect and genuine care. Blood relation is not a guarantee of love, and love cannot exist without honesty and integrity. Father McKenna stepped forward, placing his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of support and blessing. "Let us pray," he said, "for wisdom, for healing, for the strength to choose truth over comfort, and for the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves." As the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, I looked around the church. One more time, Jennifer had fled during Father McKenna's words, unable to face the community that now knew exactly what she had done. David remained in his seat, his head bowed not just in prayer but in shame. The funeral was over, but my life was just beginning again. In the weeks that followed, Millbrook buzzed with conversation about what people had begun calling Margaret's miracle. The story spread beyond our small town, attracting attention from newspapers and television stations fascinated by the tale of a woman who had attended her own funeral to expose her family's betrayal. Jennifer left town immediately after the church service and never returned. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that she had resigned from her job, moved to another state, and was living under circumstances far more modest than the lifestyle she had maintained while planning to inherit my estate. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, but I felt no sympathy either. David remained in Millbrook for several weeks, trying to rebuild our relationship and demonstrate his commitment to being a better son. His efforts were genuine, but the damage to our relationship was profound. Trust, once broken so completely, could not be easily repaired. Eventually, he returned to Portland, though he called regularly and visited when he could afford to. Our relationship remained cordial but distant, forever marked by his failure to protect me when protection was needed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.